I'm really glad to be here with all of you Luca communicators from all over the country. I think the job that Luca does is an extremely important one. It's one that I believe in and one that kind of pushes me to get out there and do everything I can for the UAW and for the labor movement. The picture that you're looking at right now is from the Forvia strike here in Missouri. As Roy said, I'm at Local 249. That's the Ford Motor Kansas City Assembly Plant. We're a big operation. We got a lot of members and a lot of resources. But Forvia members who went on strike just before the first of the year are in one of the most anti-union corners of Missouri, in a state that has tried to pass right to work repeatedly. And the Forvia members feel a little isolated. I spoke with their servicing rep, and he said they sometimes out there all by themselves, a small plant, feel a little bit neglected. So they were really glad to get some coverage for their strike. You can see they're out there in the cold weather, and they went up against management that took a very hard line, initially proposed takeaways, but they held strong and they won a good contract. So that's the kind of the importance of what we do, is it helps keep the morale up for our members when they're going through tough times. When you're getting ready to do an interview, sometimes it can put a lot of pressure on you. Maybe you're new to interviewing. Maybe you've just been appointed to communications and you're local. So the purpose of this class is to get you set up with the fundamentals so that you can do an interview and feel good about it and get what you need from that interview and present it to your members. Preparation really is the key to doing a good interview. You want to research the subject and topic of the interview thoroughly beforehand. And it's always important to develop questions that will push the interview along and set goals for what you want to do. There are a number of ways now that you can conduct interviews. Everything used to be over the phone or in person, but Zoom makes a fantastic medium for conducting interviews. Better than the phone, you can see the facial expressions of the person you're interviewing and get a feel for how that's going. I've taught writing for a number of years at Luca conferences, and I always make an assignment. We always have a class project to write either a lead paragraph or an article based on one of the speakers' presentations at the conference. And from what I hear from John and Roy, we're going to have some good speakers this year. And I think it's always a good project for people to write an article while they're at Luca, maybe speaking to or writing about one of the speakers and taking that home to your publications. But a couple of times when I've made these assignments, about half the class comes back the next day and they say, well, I forgot my pen or I didn't have anything to write on. So it seems silly, but having the materials that you need when you're doing the interview, I prefer pen and paper. I'm old enough that people used to ask about tape recorders, but I don't think anybody's doing that anymore. Phones have some advantages. You can actually get apps. They're going to cost you a little bit of money that will produce a transcript of the interview. So you might consider that. But one thing to think about is that being interviewed or being recorded during an interview can make people nervous and that force them to clam up. There's some legal considerations too. You need to get the interviewee's permission to record. So you have to ask them about that before you do it. And that's especially important if you're doing it over the phone. There are laws and different laws in different states about recording, but to be safe, you really need the person's permission to do a recording. And I found that a good set of notes is usually the best way. The problem with a recording is that you can have trouble going back and forth and finding what you need. It can be very time consuming, whereas looking at notes on a sheet of paper, it's all right there in front of you. When you're planning your interview, you need to think about what medium you're going to use. Is it going to be a newspaper? Or is it a simple Facebook page? If it's your local's newspaper, you may be doing a much more in-depth article than Facebook or Instagram, which are going to have, or Twitter, or now, well, when I put this together, it was before Blue Sky. So some of us are on Blue Sky now because I found Twitter is not very useful anymore. But some of these are going to be short form that are not going to allow for a long article. And the other thing, a lot of our members now are doing podcasts, they're doing videos. Their local may have an app, but particularly with podcasts and videos, you don't have the luxury of editing and going over your interview after it's over. The interview is the product, so it has to be right when you're doing it. You also need to consider your audience. We have a lot of different sectors in the UAW, and the article that you're writing, the interview you're doing, really, in most cases, needs to be directed at the sector that your local represents. An article, I've spent my career in auto, and that's going to be a little bit different than something that's directed at the issues around higher ed or gaming, aerospace, ag. However, that being said, sometimes, if you've really got something good, you may want to send it off to Solidarity. You may want to send it up to Solidarity House for the Facebook page up there. And then you need to think about some of the shorthand that you'll use for your members. Your local isn't going to fly for a wider national audience. So think about those things. Think about, maybe we're in a period of negotiations in Ag-Im and we want to tell a story to the whole membership. So it's going to need to have some broader things. You're going to need to explain where this is, where, for your local members, they already know where they are. But for example, I might just say local 249 in an article, but if I'm writing for Solidarity, I'm going to have to say local 249 at the Ford Motor Kansas City Assembly Plant in Missouri, just to locate that for members who aren't there. Make sure to arrange the date, time, and place of your interview in advance. And I like to text or make a call shortly before, like a day before, just to firm that up, because you'll find that sometimes people get busy and forget that the interview is coming up and you're setting it up, you're calling, and you're not getting an answer. Write out your questions ahead of time. Now, you're going to develop more questions as you go through the interview, hopefully, but you need to have a framework in place at the beginning and know where you're going. Also, don't start with the first question on your list. Make some small talk. Get a little rapport established between the two of you. A lot of times when somebody's being interviewed, and the truth is most of our members, including most of our officers or committee people, aren't that used to being interviewed. They're not like politicians or actors who get interviewed all the time. So you need to get them loosened up and talking and chatting a little bit ahead of time before everything gets serious can really make your interview more successful. Also, at the beginning of the interview, make sure that you ask them to spell their name. I can't tell you how many times I get articles sent to me where somebody made a guess at the spelling of the person's name. And when you make a guess, a lot of times that guess can be wrong. So ask the interviewee to spell their name. You're also going to probably want to talk to them again after the interview is over. So make sure you get their mobile, work numbers, email, all of that stuff so that you can, you think you've got everything, you're there, you're writing the article, and suddenly a question pops into your mind. You need it for the article and you don't know what the answer is. And then you're going to want to make that call and say, hey, I forgot to ask you this. A lot of our members, we're all familiar in the paper. You're going to read about doctors, lawyers, politicians, but who knows about the right-hand seat install? Or, we've got a million different jobs that we do. And I always think it's important to tell what job that person does, because that's a big part of the story. And it's a big part of the story that outside of our publications, probably most people will never know about. So find out what job they do, where do they work. At our plant, we've got a truck plant and a transit plant. We've got shifts all over the place. So where do they work? What shift are they on? And I always like to ask, how long have they been a member of the UAW? And how did they find their way in? This it can really be an interesting story. We just have to think to tell it. So what's the worst answer you can get to a question when you're doing an interview? I think the worst answer you can get is either yes or no, because you're not going to be able to use that in your article. You need to get people to expand on things, tell you stories, find out about their emotions, how they feel about things. A number of years ago, he was a production worker in our truck final area by day, but on nights and the weekends, he was an international boxing referee, and he traveled all around the world refereeing boxing matches, including at the Olympics. But he was an extremely stoic guy. And no matter how hard I pressed, I had a very difficult time getting any kind of stories out of him. And I ended up basically kind of describing who he was, because I didn't have anything really to go on. So we try to get him to talk, try to dig deeper. When you get one answer to a question, try to push beyond that, because everything you're getting from people is really the gold that goes in your article. I don't know. This is kind of a standard guide, but hypothetical questions that might work for you. But clarification questions, what do you mean by that? That is going to be something that you're going to use quite often. You want to know the context, what's going on. If you're in a strike situation, what are we know we're going on strike, but why are we going on strike? And then we want to know, what's the situation? Is it a favorable situation? Is it an unfavorable situation? All of these things are kind of the meat and potatoes of the article that you're going to want to produce. Now, I'm kind of a slow and clumsy writer myself, and I got a lot of Xing out and stuff like that. And so I interview people and they talk fast, and I get the first 10 words, but I miss the last 10 words. So ask them to slow down, ask them to repeat. And I just usually say, hey, I'm not that fast, kind of work with me here. And I never have a problem with that. People usually by this point, they're glad to be talking and wanting to tell their story. Let's talk about handling quotes. One thing you don't want to do, if you're writing a longer article, you don't want to use a quote in your lead paragraph. You probably only want 2 or 3 quotes in the article. You're taking the best little nuggets that you got out of your interview and using those as quotes. So where do we go? Accuracy is critical in these matters. You want to make sure that the context is given. Now, I'm saying exact wording of the interviewee's message, but we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a second. You want to make sure that no matter how you handle the quote, that what they meant is what you convey in the article. You want to attribute it to the person, and you want to select pertinent things that really jump out, things that convey emotion, feeling. Those are going to be the things that are going to juice up your article and convince people to read it. And then you also need to make sure that they're comfortable being quoted. And it's not unusual to find somebody going through a whole interview with you, and then they say, oh, they think about it. Do I really want my name used? So you gotta talk to them about that a little bit. This is Yogi Berra. It ain't over till it's over. It's one of the most famous quotes out there from a very quotable guy. And you notice that the grammar isn't exactly the Queen's English. I said that we wanted to get the quote right, but we also want to clean it up a little bit. if you're listening to me, you've heard me go and stuff like that. We're gonna clean all of that stuff out there because nobody wants to read on in between. And you may interview people quite often who their grammar isn't perfect. They may make mistakes, and we don't want to embarrass them by printing a grammatical mistake that they make. And it's perfectly okay to clean up somebody's grammar and to tighten up the quote as long as you don't change the meaning of what they said. But you also wouldn't want to clean up the grammar of "it ain't over till it's over," because you've passed over one of the great quotes of all time. So if somebody is using an ain't or something like that to make a point or communicate more effectively, use that because they know what they're doing. So I already said we're in using quotes, we're only looking for a very small number of quotes in the article. Your readers are going to get very tired of seeing quote marks every paragraph. So we use what we call paraphrase. You use the information that your interviewee gave you during the interview, but instead of putting it all in quotes, you rewrite it slightly and then deliver that as the story. With paraphrasing, you don't need to use quotes, but you should make sure that you indicate who the source of that information is. You don't have to indicate the source every paragraph necessarily, but as long as it's clear from your writing who's providing this information, then you're good. So what we're after in the most basic sense, because remember, your interview could be a 750 word article, or it could be a one paragraph Facebook post. But whatever it is, what we have to find out is the 5 W's: what, who, why, when, where, and how. So make sure that when you're doing your interview, that the questions that you prepare will lead you to answers to all of those questions. And then, if we're talking about an article, there are 2 ways to go. We could do a straight news story, which, is kind of in the pyramid. The format of it is a pyramid style, where the most important information is up top. So you want all of your 5 W's to be in the lead paragraph, and then you'll go on from there. You may also be writing a feature story, and a feature story uses techniques that are taken from fiction to tell a more interesting story. One of the things that we know about people choices when they decide whether to read something or not is, does it affect them personally? Is it interesting? And we know that a lot of facts and figures don't necessarily convince anyone and don't necessarily motivate them to read your story. My wife wants to kill me sometimes, but when I get the mail, I stand next to the trash can and I look at the piece of mail, and if I think it's important, I'll set it in one stack. If I don't think it's important, I'll throw it directly into the trash. And that's kind of the way it is when people are deciding. They open up your paper or they're skimming through your Facebook page. Am I going to read this article or not? So if they only read the first paragraph and you communicate the most important information, the 5 W's, then at least they've gotten that. If you come up with a great hook for your article and encourage them to go further, then that's fantastic. And that's what we're headed for, or that's what we really want. So we want to convince people to read our articles. Let me talk a little bit. I said at the beginning that I think our job is extremely important, and it's extremely important right now. More than 3,200 newspapers have vanished since 2005, and they continue to disappear at a rate of 2 a week. In the past year, 130 newspapers shut their doors. So that we have a situation in this country where we have news deserts, big swaths of the country where there is no longer any local newspaper. That is increasingly being filled by people going to social media for their news. And as we know, if they're going to Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, or going to X with Elon Musk, they're being fed an algorithm of news that can be extremely distorted and in most cases anti-labor, anti-worker. And what's the result of that? Trump's national popular vote, he says he has a mandate, but he just won by 1.5%. But he won 91% of news desert counties by an average of 54 points. When I found that, I was staggered by how stark those numbers are. It shows what's going on in this country right now. And it shows what role Luca members can play. Because we know a few things. Most of our members get our publications. Most of our members are on our Facebook pages. And our union communications may be the only counter to this problem that our members ever get a chance to see. So in order to keep, our job to survive as a union is to keep organizing unorganized plants. And that means winning over our members, organizing and helping them to understand what's going on with politics. I told you that here in Missouri, the legislature, which has had a Republican trifecta for more than 20 years now, has repeatedly tried to pass right to work. However, in 2018, they actually got a measure to block right to work, to overturn the right to work legislation passed in Jefferson City, and it won big, and it won in many rural counties. So we have an audience out there that is not being treated very well by the sources of media that they have access to, except for us. So I would encourage everybody to find out, telling stories about our members, what they're doing. And I'll close with one example from our paper a couple months ago. We had a woman, a member of Local 249, who got appointed to organize it. And we talked about it. We thought, hey, that's not a bad story. So I assigned one of our reporters to go talk to her and put together a story. Well, she did, and what she found out in the interview was fascinating. This woman, this member, was married to a guy who worked at the GM Janesville plant in Wisconsin, which most of you know was shut down a couple of years back. And so her husband transferred to the GM plant here in Kansas City. And as often happens in these things, that put stress on the marriage and they got divorced. She was a school teacher, but found that she couldn't make it on a school teacher's pay. And Ford plant here in Kansas City was hiring. So she hired on at the Ford plant and she became a super activist, was involved in committees, going door to door for candidates and stuff like that. And eventually seemed to be the kind of person that would really do well in organizing. And that in auto, that's a huge story. We talk about the GM gypsies. The social costs of the decisions that these companies make are enormous. People are often leaving their grandparents behind. I have talked to and interviewed people who left their high school or college age children behind in order to follow jobs in the auto industry. So this went from being an article about, hey, this member got appointed to this great job, and we were going to talk a little bit about how important organizing is, to, hey, you know what? This is the story of the UAW, because thousands and thousands of our members have gone through this experience. Just at our plant alone, we've gotten people from California, New Jersey, Virginia, Minnesota, people transferring in from closing plants to hang on to their jobs. So it's a story that is rarely told in the mainstream media, but it's an experience that millions of American workers have lived through. And I think it's a story that deserves to be told.